Hi, today we're talking about prepositional phrases. So to start with the definition of phrases in general, a phrase is a group of words that does not have both a subject and a predicate. And that's in contrast to a clause. And as a reminder, a clause is a group of words with a subject and predicate. So a clause has a complete idea in that it has a subject, someone doing something, and a predicate, what they do. A phrase is missing at least one of those two pieces. And prepositional phrases in particular start with prepositions. That makes sense. So the purpose of prepositional phrases is often to offer context about where, why, when, or how. And I've just put a quick chart here with some different ways that prepositions can be used to give information about where, when, why, or how. So you'll notice that all of these prepositional phrases in the chart just have the preposition and then a noun, right? There's no subject and predicate, which is why this is not a clause. So the where examples here, under the table, outside the window, in chapter 2. I'll tell you where something happens. The when, after the party, during the game, until that scene. And the why or how, because of the game, despite the argument, by practicing. Obviously, since prepositional phrases don't have a complete thought in and of themselves, they need to be attached to independent clauses. So I gave you a couple examples at the bottom of this slide of how that looks when you attach the prepositional phrase to an independent clause. So for the first one, my prepositional phrase here is going to answer the question of when, and the sentence is, the two teams got in an argument during the game. I can also flip that around and put the prepositional phrase first. During the game, the two teams got into an argument. My second example answers a question of how. The independent clause is she raised her batting average by 50 points, and then the prepositional phrase by practicing. I can also flip that around, as you'll see underneath that. So the next few slides talk about how we can use prepositional phrases in writing. And one great use of prepositional phrases is to show change over time. So if you're talking about a book or you're talking about a series of events from your life, it's often really helpful to give your readers or your listeners kind of a signpost for when you're talking about, right? If you say, I loved playing hide and seek, right? You might want to clarify, I loved playing hide and seek when I was 6 years old, right? To kind of give people a sense of when you're talking about. So in this example, I'm talking about Sungju's beliefs about North Korea, and those change throughout the course of the memoir. So it would not make sense for me to just make any of these statements without giving a timestamp for when it happens. So that's what my prepositional phrases are doing. So to start from the beginning of that paragraph, I said, at the very beginning of the memoir, Sungju wholeheartedly believes that North Korea is the best place on earth. Throughout the next few chapters, however, he is told information that contradicts this belief. Sungju really starts to question his government after seeing an execution with his class. So you see that I'm showing 3 different stages in his beliefs, and I have those prepositional phrases to mark when I'm talking about. Otherwise, it would get really confusing. Another helpful use of prepositional phrases is to compare different places or situations. So if in terms of comparing and contrasting, prepositional phrases can help you move back and forth to indicate, for example, in this book, in contrast in this book, right? Or in this poem, similarly in this poem, right, would be a way to contrast different works of literature. Here in this example, I've used it to contrast the 2 different places that Sungju lives. So I wrote, in the capital, there are amusement parks, taekwondo sojos, and plenty of food. In the countryside, however, Sungju is introduced to public executions, widespread unemployment, and food scarcity, right? So clarifying, I'm talking about here versus here. And the more complex you're getting and moving back and forth between those different places or situations, the more important it is to use those prepositional phrases to indicate where you are. Just one more example of why it's necessary to use prepositional phrases. In my dream, I was just out for a regular walk when I got abducted with aliens, right? If I had not clarified in my dream, you would think that I was narrating to you from Mars, right? So important to indicate this was in a dream. And then the transition after opening my eyes, I realized I hadn't been abducted by aliens after all. One final slide, and this is a clarification slide. So prepositions can also start dependent clauses. So here's where it's really easy to get confused between prepositional phrases and dependent clauses, because you might just see a preposition starting a group of words and assume that it's a prepositional phrase. But if you have a subject and predicate after the preposition, that means you have a dependent clause. So this chart hopefully helps clarify that a little. What I underlined on the right-hand side is the subject and predicate. So I can say the same thing in a lot of cases with the prepositional phrase versus with a full dependent clause. So my first example is as a child, right? That's a prepositional phrase. Or I can turn it into a dependent clause by just adding the he is, when he is a child. Similarly, in my dream is a phrase, while I was dreaming is a dependent clause. And lastly, after the execution is a prepositional phrase, whereas after Sungju sees the execution has that subject and predicate. So prepositional phrases and dependent clauses are both awesome. You should use both of them. Just I don't want you to get confused between the two of them. All right, so that is all. Thank you for listening.